Thank you again for joining Fit Inspired Mama. Today with me, Nishma Karim. Today I have Zafira with me talking about adoption. She had adopted her little boy. And so she's here talking to us about her journey and about adoption and the things that she went through and how it all worked out. Have you actually thought about going through adoption? Have you thought about maybe you want to go and adopt as well? I know I did. At one point, I also wanted to adopt, thinking that I may never get pregnant. Something might just go wrong, or just out of your heart, you just wanted to adopt. Do you know the ways to go adopt? Do you understand all the resources you need when you're adopting a child? Well, here's a story with Zafira, and she's going to explain to you about adoption and how she went through adopting her child. So let's talk to Zafira. I am so excited to have Zafira here with me today. Zafira, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your beautiful story of you, of your adoption story. Seeing your son running around is so beautiful, especially when I see him, knowing that he is adopted, but you have this bright story that I want to hear from you, and I'm very I'm very blessed to have you here to share that with everyone around so they can hear you and they can, if they have any questions, they can ask you. This is a story, and I think for me, it's a big one because when I wanted to adopt, I didn't really know too much of the process of doing it. And I know that there are people out there that may want that information. And what a beautiful time to talk about it if people do want to adopt. And not only that, they can get a little bit more insight from what you've gone through and things that they might want to change or things they might want to do differently. So, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing your story.
My pleasure.
Let's start with what brought you to think about adoption?
It's an interesting question. I have a couple of adopted cousins and an aunt that was adopted into our family when I was obviously before I was even born. So adoption has been very normal in my family. When my brother passed away, my mom and dad made this difficult decision to not try and have more kids because it would have caused a lot of complications for my mom's health, and to try and pursue the adoption avenue. And I watched them probably from the time I was 4 or 5 years old until when I was 10, when they finally gave up, struggle with the process of international adoption and the bribery that came with it in the 80s, and the fees and the stigma around interracial adoption, transcultural adoption, things like that. And I can go back to like fourth grade. We had to do a project on what is called About Me, and I still have the book. And when I look at what I envisioned my family to be like, I was going to be a doctor and a lawyer with 16 children. And my children were literally of all colors, all races. Like there was ones with more Asian features, ones with like, kinky Afro hair, and there was blonde kids. So I clearly had this in my mind from a very young age that it was very normal to have a very mixed and blended family.
That's so cute that you say that because I personally actually had a fun little thing that I actually did the same thing. My vision was 8 kids. I wanted a soccer team at one point. So when I did meet my husband, I said yes, I wanted to do a soccer team, and I was totally ready for it. And then when I had my first child, I thought about it after that. And then I was like, okay, she needs a sibling. So I had a second child. And then I'm like, I'm done. I am never going to have another child. It is
Yeah.
over. It's done. Like, I don't think I could ever have done it. But in my heart, still kind of says, I wish I could adopt. It is still
Well, and
a
you
part of,
can.
it is part of my thing. I always do talk to my husband and say, even if we can find someone that's 5 years old or 6 years old, I don't mind adopting a little bit older. But then again, there's so many things that I want to know of because adopting an older child means they're more aware of what's going on. They're more aware of what's the surrounding is. They're more aware that you're not really their family, that you're not really their mom and dad. So, stuff like that, that really catches my interest in adoption.
Mhm.
So, I am so happy that you decided to do this. Give us a little bit more insight on how you decided to go on board doing this and what you came about when you started to fill out the paperwork and you started to think about doing the adoption. What did you go through and how was the process of getting this beautiful adoption into your home?
So it's interesting if you look back at like my dating history, as soon as I was old enough to date adults, so like out of high school, everybody I dated was somehow a single dad. They already came with children. They were never, okay, maybe some of them were, but typically there was someone that had some kind of attachment with them. And I was in this long-term relationship with someone who was divorced and had 3 kids and didn't want more. And we weren't sure where our relationship was going. We'd been together for a few years, but I had always been very honest about, listen, I need a child, and it doesn't matter if it's with you or not. And he was super supportive and was like, you know what, like I'm here to support you. Let's figure that out. And so I was still in a committed relationship, talking about marriage, and pursuing a single parent adoption, which was kind of, I think, not the typical way people do it, right? People are usually in a relationship, planning on a family with that person, or perhaps on their own, or not sure what's going on or transitioning. But I was very much in a happy relationship, looking at this avenue, and I loved his kids. I mean, I still talk to them, but it was kind of that point. I was, how old was I? 30 something, early 30s. So like no fertility issues, nothing like that, but it was very much, and I want to adopt. And so I knew there was 2 ways to adopt. There's the international way, where you're looking at agencies and profiles and fees and immigration. And then there was the local way through foster care. And I was reminded about a lot of the values just growing up that my parents had shared, and culturally that we share, about like making Canada your home. And so I wanted to start at home first. And it didn't matter to me what the child looked like, or right, what gender they were, what their culture of origin was. So I started the process. I went to an information session. I made an application. I went through some interviews and screening process with a social worker from the ministry. And then they send you to school. And in those days, it was 6 weeks of school during a weekday for a full 2 days a week.
So is the
So I had
school
to take time off work.
so is the school kind of teaching you how to
It's
adopt?
so it's not teaching you how to adopt, it's teaching you about the issues kids in care come with.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. So now it's an online course, it's compressed, right? COVID has changed some of that, but also technology has made it a lot easier that it's evenings. But really, it's things like every child who's adopted, for example, doesn't matter how old they are, goes through a disruption with attachment, because their attachment to the person that biologically carried them for as many months as the birth mom was pregnant carried them. And then suddenly they have a new parent. So it doesn't matter if you're adopted, from the moment you come out of somebody's uterus, or if you are adopted at age 17, 18, or 19 in BC, you're going to have an attachment challenge because there's been a disruption. So they talk about attachment, they talk about drug and alcohol exposure, they talk about medical issues that kids might be surrendered into care for, social and trauma issues that might be in the family home that led to the child being apprehended. So kids in foster care they don't just come to foster care healthy, right? They're typically taken from their birth situation because there's a problem. And so they really want you to go in eyes wide open. And so 6 weeks of class, a lot is very emotional. They're talking about so many things, that you are confronted with any demon you've ever had in your life, any bias you've ever had, and people drop out through the process. And people struggle through the process. And there are people in that class that might be trying to adopt their biological grandchildren or biological siblings or nieces or nephews, because to adopt within foster care, you have to go through that.
Oh my
Or
God.
people who are looking at adopting a child they don't even know exists yet. And so in my group, we had several married couples that were going through fertility challenges. There was a couple of same-sex couples. There was a couple that had a cultural match with a child of the same culture of origin. I think they were Punjabi. And so they'd been pre-matched, but they had never gone through the system. Just somebody had approached them and they've been open to it. There was me as a single mom there, and my dad had come with me to class. It was kind of cute. There was a couple of grandparents and aunts and uncles. And through the process, through the weeks, people dwindled, right? Like the grandmas would be like, you know what? I don't need to do this. I'm already the grandma. They can keep paying me as a foster parent, which is what happens. You pay, foster families get funding. I don't have to go through all this stress and interviewing and sit here and listen to all this. They already live with me. I'm already their family. And so they would, pass through the process and give up. Some people started, I was thinking 1 or 2 couples got divorced throughout that 6-month period. They were having like marital issues. Some people got pregnant through that process because they were still working on their own fertility challenges, or in the case of same-sex couples, right, a donor, whatever they needed. So that class of about, I want to say it was about 24 people dwindled to probably about 10 around graduation time. And I say graduation only because class was over. And what else do you call it when a series of classes is over? But, went through that process. And then you go through a series of interviews, a home study with a social worker, where they're in your house, they're talking to you, they're doing reference checks like getting a job. They talk to every adult that lives in your home. They do criminal record checks. They do like huge like lifestyle sessions. Every time they meet with you, you have to refill out the same questionnaire to talk about where your threshold is with things like autism spectrum, drug and alcohol exposure, heart defects, facial disfiguration. It can be really anything, right? Anything that is not what we would consider typical in society. And if I was to picture the form, it's all these little check boxes, and it's about a section this big on the check boxes where you're checking where your comfort is. And you go through that for probably another 6 months before they approve you. Oh, wow. And then, so you're about a year and a half in, year and a quarter in at this point, because you've also waited, right, to get to be the next person they're going to talk to or the next person in class. And then they start looking for a match. And there's a lot of biases, right? So there's a bias against people of color, and they're very transparent about that. Yeah. There's a bias against single parents, very transparent, same-sex couples, people with a lot of education, because you might expect too much of a child who's got trauma issues, right? As opposed to you might advocate. And I think there's 2 lenses to that, right? So, and they're like, again, they're very transparent about the biases. My social worker at the time was going through a breakup with her spouse. And so she said to me, I'm a single mom right now. It's really going to be hard for you. And I was like, you know what? We're okay. You have to prove to them that you have support around you. And while they're looking in the system at the back end, trying to match you, you get invited to what are called matching events. So think about it like speed dating. They put up PowerPoint presentations with kids with their terrible stories, and they really pick the most heartbreaking stories. Like, this kid's been in foster care since 4 months old, 10 months old. They're 14. They've still not been adopted. Look how beautiful this child is. And they are beautiful. They have a beautiful story, but they've also been in the system for a very long time. So they have a lot of challenges. Maybe they've had a couple of failed adoptions. And so you fall in love with these pictures and these stories, and then you speed date with the social workers who want to get to know you. And so you are chatting with these social workers. You give them a 1-page or 2-page profile of your family with photographs and buzzwords, trying to show them how great you are, right? Just like dating. Yeah. And you cross your fingers that they have somebody in their portfolio, because they only present like 20, 25 kids, right? And we know there's hundreds of kids in the foster system. So I went to a bunch of those, probably one every 6 months for about 3 years.
Oh my God.
Really heartbreaking. And I won't say I didn't have kids presented to me, but I had kids presented to me that there was no way I could parent. Like, there was one little girl, I remember her story so well. She was under a year old, but she was born to 2 parents that had 2 biological parents, I should say, not 2 parents, 2 biological parents that had severe developmental disabilities and could not live independently. So they lived in adult group homes. And somehow these two had gotten together and gotten pregnant. And both these biological parents had parents that were involved in their care, even though they're adults, right? Because they were developmentally disabled. And the grandparents didn't want anything to do with this child because they knew they couldn't parent yet another child. And statistically, risk factor wise, that child would never be able to live independently. And for me, I was struggling because as a single person, and I think at this point that relationship that I'd been in for 5 years had deteriorated and broken down. But as a single applicant, I wanted to make sure I could take care of this child. And a child that could never be left alone meant I could never go to work, or I would have to have full-time like daycare, nanny care, something. And I had to think about that from a single income perspective and a sustainability perspective, right? Because that had to be feasible. And I remember crying when I said no. But the whole reason they'd come to me with that proposal was because she was brown-skinned and I was brown-skinned. We didn't have the same culture, but they were like, well, she'll look like you, so nobody will ask questions. And I kept saying, it doesn't matter if they look like me. Like, I don't care. So fast forward 6.5 years of waiting, and these proposals that just don't match. There was a 13-year-old who didn't want to be adopted, but had a story, like a life story, of a school story and interests and hobbies, much like me. And they thought she'd be a great fit. Her foster mom, where she had been since she was 2 years old, had passed away. She was 13. So she'd been in the same place for 11 years, not so many attachment challenges, but probably other stuff. Birth mom did not want her to be adopted, but foster father didn't want a teenager in the house as a single foster parent. So nobody wanted really her to go anywhere. She didn't want to go anywhere. And kids, when they're over 8 years old, get asked if they want to be adopted by the judge before they sign over the paperwork. And so I was like, well, nobody wants this. So why are you asking me if I want her? Like, of course I'm going to fall in love with this lovely story, but she doesn't want it. Bio mom doesn't want it. Foster dad is struggling with it. Like, we're just setting her up for failure.
There's a lot of emotions in adoption. It looks like you're basically going through different roadblocks. You go from one place to another, and you're just sitting there thinking, what the heck am I going to do? Where am I going to go? Who am I going to adopt? They're just putting all these kids on top of you, thinking, and you're right. Race is a big, huge thing. They're trying to match you, thinking that's what you want, right?
And you've told them, right? Through this, every paperwork you filled out every 6 months, every month for like this 2.5 year intake process, you've been clear about what you'll accept and not accept. So I finally went to my social worker December 2017, and I said, I'm done, close my file. And she was like, hang on, are you sure? What's happening? And she pushed back a little. And so I said, you know what, fine, you keep looking, but don't even call me unless you have a sure thing. I am done. Like, I'm exhausted with this. And I didn't know at the time, but my son now had already been proposed at the back end, and they were working on this file. And I hadn't been accepted yet, but it was 4 months later, they contacted me and said, we have a match. And through this process, you're also doing a yearly update on your life. And I was in another long-term relationship, and I hadn't even bothered to tell them I was dating somebody, let alone that we were talking about getting married, because there was no point. Nothing was progressing in a meaningful way. And it was just, they'd come to your house, they'd interview, they would have had to do criminal record checks. And it was just emotionally, I was done.
Right.
So April, they came to me with this file. I walked around with his picture in my purse because they were so sure they gave me the picture, which is very rare. I walked around with this picture in my purse for about 2 weeks before I said anything to anybody. And anyone who knows me knows how hard it is for me to shut up about stuff. But I was literally like, I think April 24th until April 24th until May 14th, I didn't say a word to anybody. Not my best friend, not my dad, not my now spouse. I just said nothing. And then I called the social worker and I said, so the thing is, I'm dating someone. And she was like, hang on, we're going to have to start over. Like, you can't have this child. And I said, okay, what do we do? And so May 24th, we started a process to figure out if he could co-apply with me or if it would be easier for me to continue on my own. And they had lots of meetings at the ministry. And then they came back with, and they met him. They did criminal record checks and background checks, all the same stuff. And then they came back and said, okay, you know what? It's going to be easier if you just apply on your own, but then you have to promise that he will not meet your child for the first 4 months at least. There will be no overnights. There will be no, no introducing him as dad. You are mom and you are the person he meets. That's it. And so we talked about it and we decided to proceed. And so it was May 28th, I think, at this point, and I went to work and I said, so I'm adopting and I'm going to be off work for a year and 2 weeks. And so it was like the longest pregnancy equivalent, right? 6.5 years at this point, that I'd been waiting. So I had and then suddenly I tell work I'm gone in 2 weeks. And yeah, and so here we are 3 years later, right? He moved in 3 years, 6 weeks ago, and it's a little shocking to me on a daily basis. But the process was hard. And in there, we touched on this a little bit. I thought about the international route and would it be easier? And there's roadblocks there too, right? So there are some countries that will not accept applicants of a different religion. So you can only apply if you're the religion of the majority of that country. A lot of countries won't accept single parent applications. And then there's also the waiting process and the fees. And so if you're Caucasian trying to adopt within North America, the adoption fees can be, if you want like a child of the same race, can be up to like $20, $40, $60, $80, $100,000. If you want a different race child, depending on the race of the child, it's less because the kids are less wanted.
I don't know why, but
right?
I feel like the adoption agency is like a money-making magnet.
Well, and this was what my mom struggled with, right? She was like, I don't want to go buy a baby.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how I felt. So I thought about it. I went down the road and then I just be like, no, I just can't. I need to adopt a kid that is from here. It just became more and more important to me. Right? They don't deserve more or less of a chance, but lots of people are interested in kids from overseas and less so locally. Like we kind of forget about this, the thousands of kids in this province anyways, right? That are available.
Is there a difference? Because sometimes when you do adopt from overseas, you can sometimes be guaranteed that the mother just never wanted the baby and there was no any side effects, right? Of the baby.
So can they guarantee that the mom never had alcohol and she was honest about it? They can't.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you think about the cases like in Pakistan and India, they have those boxes where you can just go drop off a baby that you don't want. I don't know if you've heard about this, but like the outside orphanages and all these hospitals, you can literally just leave a baby and walk away, no questions asked. So you can get an infant. I have a friend going through that process right now. Her son's coming home at age 1.5 years. But you're immigrating them, and because they don't come with BC or Alberta or whatever province you're in health information, if it turns out they have major health issues, that government can refuse to cover support for medical issues.
Oh, I had no idea.
So imagine if you got a kid. So Russia is a good example, right? A lot of the kids from Russia have alcohol exposure, and that's a lifestyle, right? Piece of Russian culture. There's a lot of vodka drinking, and it's normalized. But a lot of those kids have fetal alcohol syndrome, and they don't show those symptoms until they're in school. So because it's not disclosed up front, you've brought this kid home, they have these issues, you're trying to get healthcare coverage and support. And it's Canada. So at the end of the day, you will get help, but it's not as easy. Whereas if you're adopting from within the system, you're not guaranteed support, but it's easier to get support for whatever issues are going on. And there's a lot of failed adoptions where people bring a child from overseas, find these medical issues, and then surrender the kids to the provincial ministry. And then those kids have to go through another adoption process. So you have to be really sure. You just have to be really sure.
this process just makes it feel like as if it's not only just hard for the person that's adopting, it's hard for the kids that are going through it too as well. And at the end of the day, it's like you're paying so much money to try to get that perfect child. And that child just needs a home. But I understand the fact of them, doing the criminal record check,
Mhm,
background check on you, making sure that the child is coming into the right home and that there is no like back and forth problems, having all the security and proper information before handing a child to you. I get that. I understand that. But then I guess it's also a big, huge money making system. I believe, this is the way I feel like,
mhm,
20, 30, 100 thousands of dollars just to adopt a child. And then there are some people that are desperate because they can't have babies. And this is something
mhm,
they want to do, right?
mhm.
Here's a question for you. Um, what do you advise someone when they are adopting someone, when they are adopting a child? What do you advise them to do before they look into adoption?
So I think the first thing you really need to be sure about not your motives, but your motives, right? That you and your partner, if you have a partner, on the same page. I saw so many couples go through marital breakup through the process, like through those 6.5 years, right? Like, and we stay friends with the people that you meet, they become part of your network. Um, but you have to be sure you're on the same page, because once you bring that child home, if you go through, if the one parent didn't want to adopt and the one did, then the child feels that, right? Like, kids are sponges, they know what's going on. So be sure. um I think the other piece is, like, parents who have adopted, for the most part, are very open about their experience. So talk to people that have adopted, because they'll tell you what it's like I can tell you what it's like to try and adopt from India, from the Philippines, not because I went through that full process, but because I did that research and I talked to people and I engaged in those conversations with agencies and social workers. And that criminal record check and the home study piece is not much different for a private agency. It's just that they're privately staffed, so they go a little bit faster and they're a little bit more flexible. Um, Make sure you have enough money in the bank. Like Morocco, you're required to live in the country for a year before you can bring your child home. So you have to take a year off work before you even take custody of the child, to be there,
Yeah, that's
right? And then you're going to take parental leave, because then you become the parent. So now you're taking a 2-year absence from work. So
they're
you need
basically
to make sure that you've got, like, financially, that it's, because those things put strains on relationships and families, right? Um, and I mean, I have a supportive, unsupportive family, in the sense that everyone was like, this is, like, we have a lot of adoption in our family on both sides. Um, but at the same time, people are like, are you crazy? Like, why are you doing this? Just have a baby. And I was like, but I just don't want to. Like, and for me, birthing is just, some people really want to be pregnant and, like, push and get a push gift. And I was like, no, just don't want to. Not the way, and if it happens and happened, it would have been fine, but it just wasn't my choice of how I wanted to build my family. Um, but I think, and you have to be able to advocate for that. You have to be able to explain, like, if you have fertility issues, and they'll ask you, and they will ask you, and they will find out, so you can't lie about these things. Like, how are you going to explain that, yeah, I'm still going to love this child if my fertility issues suddenly resolve and I have a biological child? Or how will I handle marital breakup? And they do interview you and your spouse and your co-applicants together and separately. So making sure that, like, you just really need to be transparent with yourselves. I think the other part is being forgiving, of yourself, that it's not going to go, it's not a plan, right? Like a wedding planning, dating, like, it's not a linear road. It's going to have its bumps and turns, and being selective about who you're telling. I mean, you want to tell everybody, but then everybody wants an update, and that creates pressure for you because you don't have information to give them yet. And it can cause a lot of emotional trauma for the applicant. um
a long-term emotional phase that you're going to go through for an adoption because, oh my
and then
God.
be prepared for it to go fast. I mean, our my son's godfathers, who are in a same-sex relationship, their application to child coming home was less than 2 years. Their child is 11, and they've had him for about less than a year. Um, and that child has a lot of issues, but we have a conversation almost daily or every 2 days about like, were you ready really to adopt an 11-year-old?
Yeah.
Right? It's and
That's
they were presented with a baby and an 11-year-old almost at the same time, so they had an option, and like, I take my hat off to them for going for the
11-year-old.
one where, right, that's the one that long term would have had a harder time finding a home, but also comes with a whole lot more baggage. Like, nature over nurture, yes, you can imprint and attach easier to a baby, but I mean, my son wasn't even 2 when he came home, and I mentioned his birth mom's name to him once when he was 2.5, and he's turning, well, he's school age now, and he asks me about her by name, and I mentioned the name once. Like, you would not think that at age 2.5 he would remember at all, and it's like, and he has his own little narrative about what she was like, and what, what the circumstances were around his coming into the foster system. And I didn't give him that story. I've tried to keep it very like neutral, very age appropriate, but he asks questions, I want to say every 3 to 5 days. And that can be heartbreaking, because then he turns around and he says, it's okay, mom, I chose you. Like, he tells me that. And it's so sweet. But at the same time, as he gets older, he will learn that he didn't actually choose me. I said yes, but some, agency of people over here chose us for each other. And it's a choice to be a family, and that's fine. But his own narrative that he's building in his mind, is
A young child like that already having that story, sometimes it's a good thing that you are giving him all that information, but in a very slow process, letting him know what the situation was instead of
Mhm,
hiding it from him. And there's a lot of families that I know that today, even though they've adopted their child, they're so happy. And the child still
mhm,
doesn't know that they're adopted because they've kept that child as their own. And they
mhm,
don't want to tell the child that they're adopted because from them, they had them since they were babies. They have kept them till today. And, and even though people know about it, like it's forgotten because
mhm.
we've all grown up together and we're all together.
And when I shared that story with him at age 2.5, it was really, we'd signed adoption papers. He'd received a book of photos, and he wanted to look at baby pictures of himself. So we'd pull them up, and he was like, oh, who's that? And I said, oh, that's your birth mom. Move
Oh,
on. It was like a third of a second. It was not a long moment at all. And he has a story. He's filled in some gaps on his own. Interestingly, his gaps are not so inaccurate about the circumstances of the story, but I mean, it's really like, what?
that's
How did you,
amazing.
right? And part of me wants to be like, okay, can we stop talking about it? Because you
Yeah.
were 2.5, and it was like, it's almost like I said to you, oh, like, I like that shirt you're wearing today. That casual, that small a moment. And then 5 years later, you're like, so about that shirt I was wearing, right? It's a moment.
Yeah. I'm very proud of you doing and going through what you've gone through, the emotional factor of adoption, about finding, looking through all these places to find that right. You basically had a dream and you fulfilled that dream. And it's so hard to say. Not a lot of people can do that. So the fact that you wanted to do something, you did it. Doesn't matter how long it took you, how emotional it was, how difficult it was, you did it. And I think that is what a lot of parents out there that are looking at adopting need to see,
Mhm,
that this is a woman, that single mom that did it by herself, not having that partner. Is it possible? Yes, it is. It is possible for anyone to adopt, but
mhm,
we need to know that there's that process, the emotional process that's going to go through. It can take 4, 5, 6 years. It can take 2 years, like you said. I think
mhm,
when anyone wants to get into it, there should not be any kind of hesitation. There should not be any kind of expectation. that this is going to happen soon, or I'm going to find something soon, is just go with the flow.
Mhm. Very much so.
I'm so happy that you did that. I'm so happy that you brought this up. You're a star. You're beautiful. Such a wonderful moment. I've seen you with your little baby boy, and I'm so proud to say that you're my friend and you're here and you're able to tell us a story about it. So thank you so
He's
much.
not so little now, huh? COVID. He's almost as tall as me now, which is a little scary.
Just a quick question though. Did it cost you that much money to adopt here in Canada? No.
Foster adoptions are actually fully funded by the government.
Well,
So
anyone else that's looking for adoption here, good idea.
yeah. So there is like that other piece that because you're not putting all that money into legal fees and agencies, for me, I was like, I can turn that money into extra care for him. Like if he needs an occupational therapist, a speech therapist. And when I got him, he was behind, like he wasn't meeting his milestones. And it was the first 6 months of my adoption leave that we were like physio, occupational therapy, speech therapy, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, like everything you could think of. It was like this intense learning bonding period. And then he was exceeding his milestones, which goes to show that you can turn that around, but you have to be dedicated to it. And when I got him, he had 3 words, and 6 months later, he had about 700. And I
Wow.
would count every day. I would add the word to the list on like a little whiteboard and just like, right. But yeah, it is fully funded, which helps. If you go through an adoption agency to adopt within Canada,
Yeah.
it's not funded. And that's an interesting one because if you were a pregnant teenager wanting to give your child up for adoption, they would tell you to go to an agency. And you might have been using drugs and you might have been using, drinking through your pregnancy, and your child may be at risk for a lot of stuff, but the agency doesn't ask those questions. Whereas if the child is born and with a family and then apprehended into foster care, the ministry asks all those questions. So it's a difference of like, 4 months, what point your child actually goes away from you. But that helps.
That's such a beautiful story. I'm so wowed with your story. I'm so glad that you're here. Oh my God, Zafira, thank you so much for
No,
sharing that with everyone. It's so beautiful to hear someone that actually has gone through it. So someone can, if anyone is hearing this, are able to be to say, yes, this is what I want, and I'm going to go and try it out. I'm going to go and do it. There will be a lot of questions out there. There will be mothers saying, I want to talk to her. Can she may have more information for me that I might not be able to find outside? How would they be able to get a hold of you?
I think when you tag me and stuff, people can reach out. It's all good. I spent a lot of years on the board of directors for the Adoptive Families Association, and so I would spend a lot of time talking to prospective families just in that. And now I sit on another board, and I talk to lots of people about adopting teens in care. So yeah, I'm happy to have that conversation. You can also email me, zafira@zafira.ca. It's actually really easy. Don't send me spam though. I'll get really annoyed. But yeah, no, I'm happy to have that conversation. And people are always connecting with my friend so-and-so has questions. Like I get these random WhatsApps and Facebook chats, and it's all
Perfect.
good.
So can I add your Facebook or Instagram account into the description below? So then
You
if they need
can,
to contact you through Messenger or something,
you can.
and your website as well, I'll add that in there as well. I want to say thank you again so much for being here, being the woman that you are. You are so beautiful, so internally gorgeous, and a beautiful mama out there. So be who you are and inspire others just like you already do. And everyone that is listening, all the descriptions will be below. And I hope that you did get some information. If you are looking at adoption and you want to adopt, Zafira is your lady. She's the one. Go talk to her, message her. She's amazing. I'm going to end the call today for this beautiful conversation that we just had. Don't forget to subscribe. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.